Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first conversations on Asian theologies and cultures. We're going to be having a number of these sessions where we'll be joined by participants from Jesuit theological centers from a number of different countries. We have theological centers from India, Vietnam, Indonesia, Philippines, Taiwan, Korea, and Japan. So I'd like to give a very warm welcome to everyone. Before we start, for those of us who are on Zoom, I would kindly ask everyone to have their microphones muted so as to not cause any distractions as we will be sharing and listening this evening. And I would also like to ask all the participants if you could add the country where you're currently at as part of your name, so that when we'll be sharing and discussing, we'd be able to know who we're speaking to and where we each come from, to be able to appreciate the cultures also of the sharings that we'll be able to listen to. So without further ado, excuse me, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Rob Rizzo from Loyola School of Theology, where we're currently hosting the first of these conversations. And I'd like to now introduce Father Stani de Souza, the Provincial and President of the Jesuit Conference of South Asia, who will have some welcoming remarks for us. Father Stani, the floor is yours.
Dear Father Tony Moreno, President, Principals and Deans of various theology faculties in South Asia and Asia Pacific, and my dear participants, good afternoon and good evening to you all. At the outset, kindly accept my compliments and congratulations on this novel and also very relevant initiative, Conversations in Asian Theologies and Culture. I appreciate this venture for three reasons. First, it is a forum to speak about our theologies, Asian theologies and cultures. And I think we are very rich in both theologies and cultures. Second, I think this very concept is very close to Ignatius. Ignatius calls the Society of Jesus a body, a universal body. And here, all of our Jesuits and our collaborators are there, and they say, when the Jesuits meet, the society meets. So I'm very happy about it. Third is, we are towing the line of GC36. We said discernment, collaboration, and networking provide three important perspectives for our contemporary way of proceeding. So we are collaborating, we are discerning new ways, we are collaborating, and we are networking. So once again, I thank you for this very good initiative and intervention, and I wish the participants a fruitful dialogue on Asian theologies and cultures. Once again, welcome and have a great evening.
Thank you very much, Father Stani. And now I would also like to introduce Father Tony Moreno, the President of the Jesuit Conference of Asia Pacific. And I'd like to invite him for some welcoming remarks too.
Good afternoon to one and all, and welcome to the participants, faculty.
Tony, the floor is yours.
Can I be heard now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. As I was saying, I welcome one and all to these conversations on Asian theologies and cultures. And special thanks to the organizers of these historic conversations. It's good that we have this kind of forum to address Asian theologies and cultures. A special warm welcome, of course, to my counterpart, Father Stani. Thank you so much for supporting this initiative. I'd like to tell you one secret. In the 70s or 80s, this topic on Asian theologies and cultures, this was already very topical at that time. And Father Nicolas, Adolfo Nicolas, our former Superior General who died last year on the 20th of May, said that at some point they really wanted to build bridges, and there was there was a time when our theologians from Asia Pacific went to India to begin a conversation on this topic, and unfortunately, that did not gain any momentum. So it died a natural death. So this particular initiative is in a way to bring to life what our forefathers started back then in the 80s. And I really would like to congratulate and encourage the different theological centers of Asia Pacific and South Asia to continue this kind of conversation. This is one way to strengthen our Asian theologies, which are manifold actually. And I hope that we will have a fruitful conversation this today and also in the succeeding conversations ahead of us. Once again, congratulations and have a fruitful time ahead of us.
Thank you very much for your kind words, Father Tony. And without further ado, then we can start this conversation. I'd like to introduce Father Rogel Abais, the Vice President of Academic Affairs and Professor of Scriptures here at LST. And he'll be sharing with us today part of his study of his thesis, his doctoral thesis, which regards a collective identity in suffering, the relevance of the Exodus narrative to the Filipino search for identity.
I think Rob froze. I can now begin. So good afternoon to all the participants in this conversation. Particular greetings to our friends in India, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and Vietnam, and those who are in the Philippines. Thank you for gracing this occasion with your presence. Before I present my paper, we will see a short video on 500 years of Christianity in the Philippines to provide us with a particular context.
A reenactment of what happened here 500 years ago. In 1521, Ferdinand Magellan, a Portuguese explorer, and his men docked on the shores of Cebu. His intention, to baptize local chiefs and their followers and to declare them subservient to Spain. Local chiefs bowed and were baptized, but one of the rivals, Lapu-Lapu, refused. And there was a battle between his tribe and the new arrivals. Ferdinand Magellan, who was in the middle of an epic voyage to circumnavigate the globe, was killed by one of Lapu-Lapu's poisoned arrows. To this day, Magellan's death remains a symbol of indigenous resistance. And Lapu-Lapu is considered the first Filipino to have repelled European aggression. The battle was won even before a nation was born, but it was the arrival of Christianity that really changed the people's way of life. 500 years later, more than 80% of Filipinos remain Catholics, and the country is the last bastion of Catholicism in Asia.
Christian faith has somehow strengthened who we are as Filipinos. We are known globally as resilient people. While the church teaches justice, there's also that sense of compassion.
But remembering the arrival of Christianity here can also be complicated. That is because it is also tied up with painful realities of 300 years of Spanish occupation. Many blame Christianity and its influence for shaping policies that are too restrictive. For example, the Philippines is the only country in the world where married couples cannot divorce. And many also say the predominant Catholic narrative has marginalized other religions in the country, including Islam. But Catholic priests have also been at the forefront of the fight for justice and equality, particularly against extrajudicial killings and other abuses of power.
We appropriated Christianity and made it our own. The faith of the people actually inspired them to be compassionate. It's not really about people's faith per se that makes us non-progressive, but it's really good leadership that spells a difference.
And the commemoration, according to the government, is not a celebration of its colonial past, but rather an attempt to ignite a sense of nationalism that is relevant to the country's present realities. Jamela Alindogan, Al Jazeera, Cebu.
Recording in progress.
Ferdinand Magellan.
My paper proposes a particular way of reading the Exodus biblical narrative. It seeks to show points of contact between the founding narrative of an ancient people with current-day peoples. I am a Filipino, and I often ask the questions, how does God speak to me? Does he deal with me in the manner he dealt with Moses and the Israelites? More importantly, how do we define ourselves as a collective? Does our profession of the one God, who is also the God who liberated the Israelites from Egypt, shape our concept of who we are as a people? It is my hope that my reflections on Filipino collective identity may find resonances in the experiences of other peoples. I am dividing my presentation into 6 parts. The body will consist of a brief characterization of coming into being of the Filipino nation, its experience of colonialization and internal oppression, the Filipino diaspora, and the formation of a collective Filipino Catholic identity. Characteristics often noted of Filipinos are their joie de vivre and resilience in the face of much suffering. No amount of natural calamity or oppression has dampened their spirit. They are able to endure these difficult and trying circumstances in their history. Through these difficulties and all their historical baggage, the Filipinos exhibit a unique identity that stands out in its Southeast Asian context. However, it is a rich identity that is oftentimes difficult to affirm and makes Filipinos anxious. This is exacerbated by how others view Filipinos and comment about their identity. In a newspaper article, historian Ambeth Ocampo discusses the relevance of 2 monuments erected to commemorate the famous People Power Revolution of the Philippines in 1986. He says, and I quote, "Monuments are erected to commemorate historic events and persons. They are supposed to make people remember. But from experience, I have seen that monuments can also make people forget. Worse, monuments can be read in many ways, sometimes with a narrative different from that intended." The article highlights the seeming forgetfulness of the Filipino people, and it questions the kind of narratives that are produced by the 2 monuments in question. One monument is an imposing statue of the Virgin of EDSA, and another is the People Power Monument located also on EDSA. Ocampo asks the questions, what do we remember? And why do we remember? He argues that the importance of these questions may be key to understanding Filipino identity and how the realization of a national becoming seems to elude the Filipino people. In relation to what has been mentioned above regarding their forgetfulness of key events in their history, one may ask if this is not so much the willful disregard of what has taken place, but a more pragmatic way of dealing with the psychological impact of these events. We posit that perhaps a deeper stream of remembrance runs beneath what is on the surface as seeming forgetfulness. This memory of suffering provokes the question of whether the Filipino joyfulness and resilience is a mere defense mechanism, an outer shell that protects a sensitive inner being, or constituent of the core Filipino character that helps the people weather the trials of life. In defining themselves, the Filipino people have slowly formed in their few centuries of existence as such, a fledgling collective consciousness and ethos. The modern-day Catholicism in the Philippines has seen a positive development as well as a struggle to shake off vestiges of its early introduction. A great question we pose is whether Catholicism, or more broadly Christianity, still comprise an important aspect of Filipino identity. What then of the identity of a minority who are non-Christians? How do they see themselves within this predominantly Christian Catholic culture of the country? The Israelites have struggled through their own process of self-definition in the Exodus. This is a monumental narrative that has survived almost 3 millennia and continues to inspire modern Jewish believers as a point of reference for their collective identity. In our view, it is a primary lens through which we can understand how Jews struggle with suffering and how it shapes their understanding of their own identity. The Exodus narrative has also been the source of inspiration for many modern-day political movements. In this paper, we will focus our attention to how some of the key concepts in Exodus 1 to 18 can be appropriated towards an understanding of a Filipino collective identity. A dominant element that will surface in our exploration of this collective identity is the role of Catholicism. The colonial counterpoint in the history of this archipelago introduced the Judeo-Christian tradition, which has so markedly determined the trajectory in which that collective consciousness has been set. Thus, we will be looking at this collective through the lenses of that tradition, and in particular way, reading Exodus with a view to possible ways of understanding this collective. Let us now look at the birth of a Filipino nation. The Exodus narrative provides a wellspring of insights that can help define Filipino Catholicity and Filipino identity. An initial insight that immediately resonates with the Filipino history is the proximity to the experience of suffering in the Exodus narrative. The structure of the biblical narrative can be used as a parallel structure alongside events in Filipino history. It is our conviction that the Spanish colonization of the Philippines brought with it both positive and negative aspects. On the positive perspective, 2 elements can be pointed out. First, it hastened the consolidation of the disparate indigenous communities in the various islands into one collective identity. Second, the Christianization of the local populace becomes a strong force along which a socio-cultural identity solidified. What we wish to advance here is the idea that the collective Filipino Catholic identity continues to unfold from its roots in early Christianization of the indigenous peoples. Using Ilana Parda's birth metaphor, we can identify crucial stages in the development of this Filipino Catholic identity. This birth metaphor applies anthropomorphic images to the Israelite story: conception in the Abrahamic origin, birthing in the Exodus from Egypt, childhood and adolescence in the wandering in the wilderness of Sinai, and adulthood in the settling in Canaan. In our analysis of the Filipino context, we will concentrate on 2 defining elements in their history which fit within the framework of the birth metaphor. One is the experience of oppressive regimes and the revolutions that arose against them, and the other is the phenomenon of migration. Oppressive regimes and revolutions. A highlight in the Exodus experience is God hearing the cry of the people because of how they are oppressed by the Egyptians. He addresses this situation by sending Moses as his intermediary to facilitate the liberation of the Israelites from their slavery in Egypt. In this process, Moses and the Israelites grow in their appreciation of who they are vis-a-vis God and the others who surround them. Their oppression and their difficulties in the wilderness pushes them hard to arrive at the point when they accept being God's people and gradually imbibe the characteristics of being such, of defining for themselves a collective identity. The idea that one can glean some positive outcome from oppression likens the process to the purification of precious metals by passing them through a furnace. Michael Walzer reinforces this idea of suffering as formative, alluding to the difficulties experienced by the Israelites as they wandered in the wilderness. There is no way to get from here to there except by joining together and marching. Thus, revolution for him leads to a positive outcome from the state of oppression. In the Philippine situation, we will try to see how this can be applied. There are two important phases in Philippine history marked with oppression. The first is the latter half of the Spanish colonial presence in the islands. The second is the two-decade conjugal dictatorship of the Marcoses. The two periods mark distinct characteristics in that the former is a foreign and external force exerting its influence on the people, while the latter is local and internal. However, in Rafael Ileto's analysis, both periods exhibit patterns which are comparable. Details of the exile, return to the Philippines, and assassination of Benigno Aquino Jr., leading to the People Power Revolt of 1986 that toppled the Marcos dictatorship, mirrors in a way the Rizal return to the Philippines, exile, incarceration, and execution leading to the revolution of 1898 against Spanish rule in the Philippines. An important element to highlight at this point and to explore later is the role of the divine in the unfolding of the events. Clearly, the Exodus narrative is constructed around the action of God in the plight of the people as the principal author of their salvation. The two moments of Philippine liberation from oppression seem to be distinct in this respect. On the one hand, the historiography of the revolution against Spain does not directly or explicitly attribute any form of divine intervention in the ensuing liberation. On the other hand, the early narratives of the People Power Revolt implicitly and explicitly define the role of the divine in the delivery of the people from the Marcos dictatorship. The shrine to Our Lady mentioned above was built to commemorate the protection that Mary afforded those who went out on the streets during the revolution. The Spanish colonial regime. Right at the opening of Exodus, we find an important information. The Israelites built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses, for Pharaoh, Exodus 1:11. This is important since it indicates how the Israelites in their oppression were constrained to build these cities, of which one is named after Pharaoh Ramses II, the putative pharaoh of the time of the Israelites' slavery in Egypt. By some parallelism, we look at how the Philippines and the Filipinos continue to bear the name of the Spanish king after whom the collective was named, Philip II. Today, we continue to identify ourselves under this name. The Israelites had a clear separation of their identity from the oppressor's identity. The Filipinos have continued to exhibit a great capacity for cultural assimilation, which can be both boon and bane in terms of their sense of identity. When Moses was sent by God to Egypt to free the Israelites from their slavery, the reason to be given to the Pharaoh was to let the people go so that they can offer sacrifice to the Lord their God. The intrinsic relationship of the people to their God is a principal feature of the movement from slavery to freedom in the Exodus narrative. This relationship was far from perfect, and the Israelites struggled with their God. However, it is the struggle in this relationship which makes God central to the collective self-definition of the Israelites. Despite their many shortcomings towards God, God is faithful to them and remains part of their lives. Likewise, the Christianization of the Filipinos has had a lasting impression on their identity as a people. In presenting Rizal's concept of the Filipino nation, Floro Quebuyen highlights the crucial role of Catholicism in unifying the people. He points out that because most of the populace was Catholic, by the time of the nationalist movement, the absence of fundamental religious distinctions was a rallying point among various ethnic groups within the local elite. Thus, being Filipino was detached from the defining criterion of blood, race, or ethnicity. He moves on to ask what then was the basis for claiming Filipino identity. In this, he points out that Rizal had a broader idea as compared to his colleagues. He went beyond the Enlightenment tradition and remained rooted in the ethical values of Catholicism. What may be gleaned from this deeply ingrained Catholicism among the Filipinos is the disentanglement of the religious sentiments from the political aspirations of the people during the revolt against Spain. This may be an oversimplified statement that does not reflect the complexities of the actual historical events that led to Philippine independence. This is beyond the scope of our presentation. The point that we want to make is simply the fact that rejection of Spanish rule in the Philippines did not include the rejection of the Catholic faith, which was brought about by the same Spanish colonizers. That the Philippines remains predominantly Catholic today is proof to this. It can be argued further that deeply embedded in the Filipino identity is a collective Catholic sensibility, even among those who are non-practicing Catholics or even those who are non-Catholics. The personal appropriation of God as the God of the Filipinos is not so different from how the God of the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was appropriated by the Israelites at the time of the Exodus narrative as their own personal God. Let us look at the Passion as catalyst of appropriation of Catholicism. After the many decades that the Israelites have resided in Egypt, the God of the fathers may have become a distant reality for them. They were exposed to Egyptian culture and religion. This was the reality in which they were immersed. God had to introduce himself to Moses as the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, when he first spoke to him from the burning bush. In fact, Moses has to ask God his name and how he is to announce him to the people. The difficulties will increase for the Israelites as Moses struggles to get them free from Egypt. They will constantly doubt him and contend with him and God. This contention will also increase as they wander in the wilderness. They will look back to Egypt and at a point even prefer the sufferings of slavery to the sufferings in the desert. It will take them time to reacquire their familiarity to the God of their ancestors and appropriate him as their God when they finally accept his commandments on Sinai. God is no longer just the deity of the distant ancestors, as was recounted in the stories handed down the generations. He has become the God who brought them out of Egypt, the God who freed them from their slavery. One of the important elements that cemented the appropriation of a foreign religion by the indigenous population was the introduction of the Passion, a Tagalog rendition of the epic story of Christ's passion, death, and resurrection in verse form. Ileto calls it the transplantation of the biblical world to the Philippines. He comments on how the biblical characters are transformed into native ones. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph talked and behaved so much like Indios that their foreign origins were ignored or forgotten. We do not intend to dispute his analysis of the text from a political perspective. What we see, nevertheless, is the long-lasting effect the Passion and what it symbolizes has on the Filipino identity. Just as the Jews continue to celebrate the Passover as mandated in the Torah, Filipino Catholics fervently observe Holy Week traditions commemorating Christ's passion, death, and resurrection. This is supported by Schumacher's own estimation of Ileto's contribution to Philippine historiography, remarking that traditional Catholicism has an important role in Philippine society. We add to Schumacher's observation that well into the first 2 decades of the 21st century, Catholicism still figures in the collective consciousness of the majority of Filipinos. This is despite the rising tide of secularism in society and the more critical stance that many of the Filipinos have with respect to the Catholic institution. The Passion is a concrete example of cultural memory which is embedded in the Filipino consciousness. It affirms Alaida Asman's assertion that the material medium has an important part to play in the process of immortalization. Together with other forms of religious traditions kept alive by the people, the Passion etches and continues to form a Filipino identity which includes and values the presence and active participation of the divine. Let us now look at the Filipino exodus from Spain. Rizal's novel Noli Me Tangere is considered by Schumacher as the first clear break from the sporadic and hesitant expressions of criticisms against the colonizers and the predominance of the friars in the Philippines. This novel not only attacked the Philippine establishment, but also proposed the ideals of Filipino nationalism and the regeneration of the Filipino people. It is notable that Rizal, in a letter to a friend regarding this work, distinguishes between Catholicism and those who tried to peddle a false religion to the Filipinos. In our exegesis of Exodus 1 to 18, the Israelites are reacquainted with the God of their ancestors through Moses. The obstinacy of the people to God's miracles may reflect a different set of expectations they had of this God of their ancestors. It will take a while before they get their bearings and allow their relationship with God to take shape based on their experiences. The Filipinos had their own Exodus experience when they went through their revolution against Spain. They fought to establish their national identity. In this process, we can observe that the religious identity underwent its own reshaping. Majority of the people remained Catholic. However, the process required the Catholic Church to make major changes. This would see the rapid transition from Spanish to American to Filipino clergy from the early 19th century to the early 20th century to just after World War II. The Marcos regime. We recall God's statement in Exodus 3:8 when he speaks to Moses from the burning bush, "I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good land and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey." This land flowing with milk and honey, usually referred to as the Promised Land, is an important element because it will give the people something to hope for as they struggle for freedom from Egyptian slavery. Two terms in Philippine narrative seem to run parallel to this Israelite symbol of hope: Bagong Bayan and Bagong Lipunan. Bagong Bayan is Filipino for new town. It refers to the current Rizal Park in Manila, where Jose Rizal, the national hero, was executed in 1896, and where today his remains are entombed in the monument to his honor. The original reference of this word was to a small town that was located there in the early 17th century. However, it acquires a nationalistic meaning after Rizal's execution, which is a catalyst of the 1898 revolt against Spain. Bayan in Filipino is also nation. Hence, Bagong Bayan is a new nation. By symbolic extension, one can see how the blood of Rizal spilled on Bagong Bayan will be the seed for the emerging new nation. Bagong Lipunan means new society. It was the political agenda advanced by Marcos during his dictatorship. This promise of a new society or a better country, however, proved to be a cosmetic means to divert attention from the growing social ills that plagued the country. The assassination of Aquino Jr. in 1983 galvanized the Filipinos to take to the streets, ending this dictatorship in 1986. The country enters a new chapter of its history after the demise of Marcos's Bagong Lipunan. The hopes were that with the re-establishment of the democratic processes, the country and its people will be renewed. The alignment of events, people, and symbolisms we see above allow us to relate these periods of Philippine history with the Exodus narrative. From a political perspective, we see how the Exodus seems to provide a framework for future revolutions as Walzer advances. The diaspora of the Filipino. The Exodus experience of Filipinos in the last 50 years, to some extent, finds its root in the failure of the developmental authoritarianism model of state building under Marcos, and protracted thereafter with the failure of succeeding governments to create enough opportunities for employment within the country. From a different perspective, this exodus can be viewed in terms of how the Filipino Catholic identity or the Filipino religiosity is significantly reflected. The analysis of Caroline Howe of Ray Ventura's Underground in Japan, which narrates his experience as an illegal worker in Japan, seeks to understand the complex situation of Filipino migrant workers. What calls our attention is that this narrative, written from a secular perspective, unknowingly highlights the importance of religion in the lives of the migrants. Evidences of religious practices of the migrants is quite apparent in Howe's analysis. She gives proof of how deeply the religious component is entrenched in the lives of Filipinos. Much so, it manifests itself in their lives even in the most disparate contexts. This also gives us an opening in terms of how the biblical Exodus narrative can be read to give a meaningful encouragement to Filipino migrants who find themselves in very difficult and many times inhospitable circumstances abroad. The progressive strengthening of the role of God in the lives of the Israelites as they left Egypt, wandered in the desert, and finally occupied the promised land reveals how it has become a pillar of their collective identity. In the same way, it is the Filipinos' religiosity that often sustains them as a group wherever they find themselves. One of the distinctive marks of Filipino migrants in various places around the world is the setting up of vibrant communities of worshiping Filipino Catholics. This has made an impact in the faith life of those localities where Filipino Catholics are present. The Filipino Catholic identity. Ricker, in his investigation of abuses of forgetting, advances the coming together of elements of memory, narrative, identity, and forgetting itself. He points out the convergence of memory with the formation of identity. In this fragile process of self-definition, he individuates the problem in the narrative function, which is in itself limited. The limitations of what can be recalled leads to the limitation of what can be narrated. He says that the idea of an exhaustive narrative is a performatively impossible idea. Yet forgetting is grafted into the narrative activity as part of an ideologizing of memory. One of the details we noted in our analysis of Exodus 1:23 is that the Israelites cried out because of their situation. It does not, however, directly indicate that they were crying out to God. Initially, we conjectured that God was the implied addressee of the cry for help. However, as the narrative unfolds in the succeeding chapter, we begin to have this uneasy feeling that the Israelites were not so familiar with God. Perhaps the length of time they have spent in Egypt has made them forget of the God of the fathers, or in the least, made him a distant figure of the past. Thus, the narrative shows us that it takes a while before the people warms up to God. The difficulties that arise in their wandering in the wilderness further supports the idea that they were in a process of reacquiring their familiarity with God. This process, as we have seen, includes the process of self-definition and the acquisition of a collective identity. What Ricker explains above brings us back to our quotation at the start of this paper, where Ocampo makes the comment that monuments are meant to make people remember, and yet they can also induce them to forget. The two monuments on EDSA are seen by the Filipinos in different ways. The imposing structure of the Virgin standing at the EDSA shrine evokes a deeply seated Catholic sentiment, which at the same time provokes a rising resentment in many Filipinos because of complex issues of their relationship with the church establishment. On the one hand, frequented by thousands of Filipinos on a daily basis, it shows a deep abiding faith in God. And on the other hand, it can be seen as an attempt to escape and forget the worries and cares of their life. Forgetting, as we have advanced, may be a defense mechanism that allows for the Filipino resilience in the face of difficulties. A stone's throw away from the Marian Shrine is a more secular monument, which is also supposed to commemorate the bloodless revolution that happened 3 decades ago that toppled the Marcos dictatorship. It is supposed to remind people never again to succumb to a repressive regime. However, it has become a glaring reminder of an unfinished task started by that revolution. At the same time, it can be seen as a monument of the people's forgetfulness for their inability to shake off corruption and other social ills that continue to plague the country. This seeming forgetfulness mirrors the situation of the Israelites as they leave Egypt. The momentous event of EDSA, which liberated the people from a dictator, is akin to the crossing of the Sea of Reeds. In the more than 3 decades after the People Power Revolt, however, we witness many years of inability to shake off the yoke of oppression unfolding. Succeeding governments are unable to curb corruption, and there is an ever-increasing list of social inequalities. Does this not remind us of the 40 years that the Israelites wandered in the desert? These were years of constantly questioning the ability of God to deliver on his promise. In 5 years, the Philippines will celebrate 40 years of the People Power Revolt. It will be interesting to see what events will have unfolded. It will also be good to look back then and see the condition of the collective Filipino Catholic identity. Memory is indeed ideologized by church and government for very specific reasons. The local church hangs on to the idea of the Philippines as the only Catholic nation in Southeast Asia, and thus that Filipino identity is synonymous to Catholic identity. The government, for its part, continues to battle with the shadow and ghosts left by a colonial past. Whatever trauma was inflicted by that past has become a convenient excuse for the failures and shortcomings in governance. Putting these two forces together, there is much ambiguity in how Filipinos view their identity. Again, this ambiguity was experienced by the Israelites as they were confronted with the difficulties in the wilderness. They would pine for the luxuries that they had in Egypt. They would look back even to their slavery with a certain fondness. Some sectors of Philippine society nowadays brazenly want to rewrite history by suggesting that the Marcos years were golden years in the Philippine history. Those who know better cry out, "Never again." This uncannily echoes the injunction in Exodus 13, 3 and 8. "Remember this day, you shall tell your child." This is an important injunction for those of us Filipinos who lived during the dictatorship to educate the younger generations of what happened then. On another note, Ricker also recognizes that ideology has an integrative role, which is as guardian of identity, offering a symbolic response to the causes affecting the fragility of this identity. The innocent form of ideology, according to him, can be encountered in societies without hierarchical political structure or societies without power. A very palpable reality is the so-called Filipino Catholic nation mentality. Jose Mario Francisco, Filipino Jesuit, in his article, People of God, People of the Nation, Official Catholic Discourse on Nation and Nationalism, examines the discourse that the Catholic Church projects of the Philippines as a Catholic nation. He explains that among the reasons for this is to protect its interests in education and as a platform for engaging in social issues. He describes the existence of an imaginary of the Philippines as a Catholic nation, which in many ways provokes the conflation of the body Catholic and the body politic. This is an apt analysis which reflects even how lowland Filipino Catholics unconsciously or consciously define themselves in relation to their national identity. It is, however, an imaginary which requires to be challenged today, as Francisco asserts, and is, in our estimation, not only in the official church discourse, but also among the Catholic Filipinos at large. While a large majority of the country are Catholics, 80.6%, such an imaginary excludes the rest of the population, around 20% or 109 million, who are non-Catholics. Thus, to avoid the exclusion of a not so insignificant minority, the Catholic Filipino identity must necessarily be disentangled from the Filipino national identity, which is a larger reality. In the Exodus narrative, there were many elements that need disentanglement for the Israelites to come to terms with their socio-religious identity as a people. This was illustrated with the ambiguity of Moses' character. We must pose the question of how he may have viewed things, given that he grew up in the Egyptian court of Pharaoh and must have been educated as an Egyptian. How much of his Hebrew heritage was he actually conscious of? We must also question the loyalties of the Hebrew taskmasters who seemed to be on the side of the Egyptians rather than their own kinsmen. When the whole Israelite community trudging in the wilderness looked back to Egypt with longing for its flesh pots, we realized that they were in Egypt for a long time and did not know of any other place, so that for all practical purposes, they were attached to many things and ways of doing things that were Egyptian. After 3 centuries of Spanish Catholicism in the Philippines, much has been ingrained in the consciousness of the Filipinos in terms of religion. It will take a long time to disentangle the practices and the ways of thinking that have been embedded in the collective memory of the people. The Filipino Catholics come with their baggage of inheriting a faith brought by their former colonial masters. This is complicated with the development of a local church that has always exerted its influence on the larger society and government and struggles to maintain its politico-religious relevance in the lives of the people. Just as the Exodus necessitated for the people to leave Egypt to renew their covenant as people of the God of their fathers, perhaps the Filipino Catholics have to reimagine themselves as people of God. In Exodus 1 to 18, we see how God refers to himself or is referred to as the God of the ancestors or the God of the fathers. It seems that God in this whole period is a distant reality for the people who had a relationship with this deity. They will acknowledge him explicitly as their God only in Exodus 19, when they declare as a people that everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do. They finally reimagine their relationship with God from being once removed to being a direct relationship. For the Filipinos, it is not so much reestablishing that relationship with God as stripping away the accrued non-essential elements of their history that may have coated this relationship. The Exodus experience clearly communicates how the God of the ancestors, the God of the fathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is not only a figure of the past, but one who has made himself manifest to the Israelites, the descendants, in a concrete way by freeing them from their slavery. In the same manner, Filipino Catholics attribute to God's personal act of saving the bloodless revolution of 1986, where images of people standing in front of government troopers in tanks only had rosaries in their hands. That religious experience is part of the official narrative of this event. The Filipinos have crossed the Red Sea when they sought their independence from Spain in 1898. They have wandered in their own wilderness in the years that saw the American colonization, the Japanese occupation during World War II, and the martial law years of the Marcos dictatorship. After the EDSA revolution in 1986, there was a great hope of finally being able to rise as a democratic nation with its people enjoying freedom and economic prosperity. We are approaching the 40th anniversary of that event, and we see how the Filipinos continue to struggle. In the words of Schumacher, kalayaan, however, is still a goal to be won for a large majority of Filipinos. Yes, Filipinos continue to struggle for freedom and to a greater extent to define themselves. Who is a Filipino and who is a Filipino Catholic? This paper has outlined only some of the important questions and ideas that revolve around a collective Filipino Catholic identity in relation to the larger Filipino identity through the lenses of the Exodus narrative and cultural memory, which is the primary focus of this research. It does not in any way investigate the complex issues that arise from these questions and ideas in an exhaustive manner. That will have to be the task of future study and research. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your reflection, Father Rogel. And in just a minute, we will be listening to the reaction by Dr. Abigail Teh. Dr. Abigail Teh is our LSD Old Testament professor. And then after her reaction, we'll be able to discuss and converse between us, everyone who's in the Zoom. So, Dr. Abigail.
Good afternoon.
Good
Can I
afternoon.
request screen sharing?
Of course.
I have some slides. Okay.
Yes.
Yesterday, November 30, was a holiday for us in the Philippines to celebrate National Heroes Day. It marks the birth of Andres Bonifacio, founder of the revolutionary movement that fought and won against Spain from 1896 to 1902. Thus, it is fitting that we talk about Filipino national identity after such a holiday, and at a time when, as Father Rogel says, attempts of historical revisionism or distortion and examples of short-term memory abound in the lead-off to next year's national elections. This topic also ties with the vision of LST to produce scholars who can do contextual readings of scripture and those who can theologize for Asia. At the start, I want to say that by ethnicity, I am Filipino and Chinese. So my mother is a Filipina. My father is Chinese, although in terms of upbringing, I am more Filipino in identity. I'm also a Protestant evangelical who has been studying at LST since 2005. So in terms of theology, I am now more ecumenical. So just as a disclosure. Actually, there is a lot to unpack in Father Rogel's presentation. There are many layers. But for today, I have chosen to highlight just 3 points for reflection. I will discuss the first one more lengthily, and the second and third ones will be shorter. The first point that I would like to highlight, because historical memory or national memory and the assessment of collective suffering is a hermeneutical process, it matters what stories we tell and retell. So my proposal is that we revisit and retell the forgotten or less known aspects of our past that can be empowering. Second point, identity, who we are, is closely linked to ethos, how we are to live. And both must be reflected in our societal structures and institutions. The third point, the journey to responsible nationhood or adulthood as a people is long and recurrent. And so we must not lose heart, but continue to persevere. I have to say that Father Rogel and I seem to have a parallel in scholarship. My dissertation work is also on cultural trauma, but while his is about the formation of identity, national identity, my focus is on recovery from cultural trauma. And I did it on the book of Ezekiel, the prophetic book of Ezekiel. We are living at a time of unprecedented suffering. The global pandemic is what cultural sociologists would call cultural trauma. We know that trauma is an injury, can be physical or psychological, that overwhelms a person's capacity to cope. Collective trauma is an injury that happens to a whole community or nation. There is massive upheaval and disruption. There is loss of our way of life, crisis in meaning, questioning of values, and even to the extent of questioning of our views of God. When this happens, especially the crisis in meaning, the questioning of our values, that is called cultural trauma. The collective suffering becomes a cultural trauma. Some examples are wars, revolutions, disease, famine, so the pandemic, what the whole world is experiencing today. The colonial experiences of many of our African and Asian nations, natural calamities, oppression, slavery, racism, etc. The impact is multi-generational. What is more hopeful to me, though, is what the cultural sociologists say. Cultural trauma is a key factor for social change. Despite the array and upheaval that cultural trauma or collective suffering brings, or precisely because of the disarray and upheaval, cultural trauma is a key factor in social change. But how a society responds to the upheaval determines whether it will lead to cultural transformation or reconstruction or cultural decay or destruction. During the pandemic, all peoples, all nations, all cultures have lost our way of life, have lost their way of life. There has been massive changes in the way we work, in the way we minister, in the way we educate. We have school, but we can see it also as an opportunity for renewal, an opportunity to retain to enhance only the most essential in our way of life. Just as the experience of slavery of Israel in Egypt led to their liberation, and the experience of colonization was ushered in the unification of the Filipino people, as well as the revolution that won for us our independence. Such is the potential of cultural trauma. Now, Maurice Halbach and John Assman says that cultural memory is socially constructed. It undergoes a hermeneutical process. Father Rogel earlier talks about remembering and forgetting. For really, in the formation of our national memory, cultural memory, there is a selection of details, a selection of themes, what we want to reinforce and retain by the retelling, and how we retell our history. So it's similar to the process of the formation of scripture. The scripture is actually the narrative memory of the people of God, the nation of Israel, as well as the early church. Jeffrey Alexander, the cultural sociologist who was part of, who was one of my main scholars in my dissertation, writes, when a group accepts a narrative for its collective suffering, that narrative has a capacity to shape the identity of the collective. Conversely, devastating events that are uninterpreted or do not develop as
It seems Dr. Abby might have some internet difficulties, so we'll just wait, give her some time to reconnect.
Thank you.
In this time, if I could remind you, as we're going to start our conversations right after Dr. Abby finishes, I'd like to ask you all in Zoom if you could add the country where you're from to the end of your name. That way, when we're discussing and conversing between us, we'd be able to have a better picture of the different cultures. In the meantime, I see Dr. Abby's internet has come back. Thank you so much, Dr. Abby.
Philippine reality. Philippine reality, yeah. Right.
So I'll give the floor back to you, Dr. Abby. Thank you.
So just when we were talking about resilience, so this narrative about the Filipinos' response to calamities is often told. Filipinos are born to be resilient. The Filipinos smile in the midst of calamity. Resilience is in our genes. But recently, this narrative has been challenged, with the statement that we romanticize Filipino resilience, and it is wrong. For example, anthropologist Dr. Michael Pan says, true resilience is not passive acceptance, but feeling empowered to do something about our situation. And there have also been calls, do not glorify resilience, but demand accountability of our elected officials. Passive acceptance affects our view of God, and a more proper idea, more proper ideology is that God is not outside the struggle for a better tomorrow, but is present through human activity. in order that resilience may lead to Father Rahel talks about Pardes' birthing metaphor, conception, birthing, childhood and adolescence, and adulthood. These are her stages. I would like to focus on the little-known narratives or the narratives of the unnamed people or ordinary people as a form of empowerment also. No? That it is not only the heroes who can do uh, who can change their lives, but it is also ordinary people, who can change our lives. For example, in the Exodus event, the birthing, the resistance of the ordinary people, the resistance of the Hebrew midwives to the decree of the Pharaoh, the action of Moses's mother and sister who hid the child, the baby, and also the action of the Egyptian princess. So long before Moses came on the scene, long before Moses was called by God, the ordinary people, the ordinary Jews, showed resistance already to their to their enslavement. So when the people cried out to God, we can see prayer as a form of protest and resistance, an unwillingness to accept the status quo. So in that way, prayer is not passive, but becomes an act of protest and resistance. So these are just examples of rewriting the narrative, telling it, interpreting it in another way that could be more empowering for our time today. In terms of Philippine history, I have attended recently, last November 20, I was able to attend a webinar on Philippine history, and I was surprised at the so much new information that I obtained, that I gained, that I want. Example, our pre-colonial past before the Spaniards came, our close contacts with neighboring countries. So pre-colonial Philippines had a thriving civilization. Then there are the localized revolts against Spanish rule, starting from the 1600s actually. So there are localized. They did not become national yet, but they show that the Filipinos were not subservient. But since the beginning of Spanish colonial rule, they resisted. They showed their courage by resisting. You have the Tagalog Revolt, Dagohoy Revolt, Ilocano Revolt, Pampango Revolt. There's a long list of revolts. And then the role of women in the revolution. These are some things that we could highlight. In terms of writings, I was pleasantly surprised to find out that in 1821, that's 60 years before Jose Rizal, before the birth of Jose Rizal, there was a pamphlet in Spanish entitled El Indio Agraviado, translated the aggrieved Indio, in which a Spanish-speaking Filipino talked about the mistreatment of the Spanish colonial government of the natives, and he took their side. He advocated for them. Then we have the role of Andres Bonifacio. In 1896, he read the writings of Jose Rizal and the propagandistas. Rizal and the propagandistas wrote in Spanish because they wanted to address a European audience, the Spanish government in Spain. But Andres Bonifacio took what he read from Jose Rizal and he addressed the people. He addressed the ordinary people in the process of organizing the revolutionary movement. He wrote ang dapat mabatid ng mga Tagalog, what the Tagalog people should know. So such stories of our own history are not so familiar, and we should invest the time in understanding our past. The Filipino historian Michael Charleston Chua, or Xiao Chua, he said that the lens by which we look at the past should be our present realities, our current context and problems. Ang lente natin para sa nakaraan ay dapat ang kasalukuyan. My second point, identity, who we are, is closely linked to ethos, how we live. That's why identity is very important. And both must be reflected in our societal structures and institutions. Jeffrey Alexander lists stages or elements of the process of recovery from cultural trauma, such as acknowledging the reality of suffering, how we narrate it, solidarity with the victims, examining the roots, assigning moral responsibility. But it culminates with institutionalizing changes in social structures to prevent it from happening again in the future. Now, in the study of Father Rogel, he covered only Exodus 1 to 18. But I want to propose that the Exodus narrative ought to include the formation of the people through the giving of the covenant and law. So these were the structures, these were the commands, these were the institutions that God wanted for the people as part of their formation as God's people. No? Richard Middleton, in A New Heaven and a New Earth, I like his definition of salvation when he said, salvation is God's deliverance of those people in a situation of need from that which impedes their well-being. So that's the Exodus event, resulting in their restoration to wholeness. Their restoration to wholeness, that's covenant and law, part of the process of formation. The seal of the Republic of the Philippines has these 4 slogans. We are makadiyos, makatao, makakalikasan, and makabansa. For love of God, for people, for nature, environment, for the nation. These are recited whenever children, school children, recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the Philippine flag. And it is enshrined in the seal. It's not in the Constitution, I checked, but it is in the Pledge of Allegiance to the Philippine flag. Faith in the Almighty, the values of truth, justice, freedom, love, equality, and peace. Respect for law, respect for government, promotion of the common good, conservation and development of our environment. So these are the duties of good Filipino citizens. But beyond the slogan, they must be enshrined in our laws and in our code of conduct and in our institutions. Now, just like with Israel, care for the poor was not only expressed through moral exhortations, but also in terms of laws and the social mechanism of the kinsman redeemer. What has happened to us in these last 6 years? Under the current administration, for me, has been a test of our institutions, a test of our democratic ideals. There was an erosion of our respect for the rule of law. There was also an erosion of the balance and checks between branches of the government. But the saving grace has been the performance of some national and local leaders, especially during the pandemic, the performance of officials of local government units and barangay leaders. Even while there was some chaos and confusion on the national level, the local leaders really gained a good training. There were a lot of learning experiences for them. And I think this will augur well for our future, that national and local leaders have been trained somehow through the pandemic. And we also gained higher, deeper appreciation for our own barangays, for our own local communities. And my last point, the journey to responsible adulthood or nationhood as a people is long and recurrent. And so we must not lose heart, but persevere. In Exodus 14, the fear of the pursuing Egyptian army led them to question their liberation. As a result, they expressed their desire to return to Egypt. This is equivalent to a romanticization of the past, historical amnesia. They preferred to remain slaves rather than experience the struggles of freedom. For in the process of becoming responsible adults, even in our nationhood, we will have to struggle and work hard. There will be many challenges. But the Israelites failed to realize that it is through the struggle that they will experience God. Professor Xiao Lim, in the same webinar, addressing historical revisionism, this is what he said, hindi sapat na sagutin ng tama o mali ang mga fake news. Let me stop sharing. So, hindi sapat na sagutin ng tama o mali ang mga fake news. It is not enough to just correct the fake news that is circulating. Kailangan natin maintindihan ang dahilan bakit naniniwala sila sa ganyang mga mito. We must understand, we must unpack why such false narratives persist, such false narratives of our martial law history persist. Sa huli, bawasan ang kahirapan para ang mga tao ay hindi aasa sa mga mito. Ultimately, we must address the poverty and structures of unfreedom that make people cling to such false narratives and myths. And so I imagine, could the moral formation of our people include an appreciation of our history and an appreciation of our cultural heritage? Should we do that in church? Or is it enough to relegate it to our schools? For example, when we celebrate a national holiday, then we can mention it in our sermons and homilies. So that's just one of my ideas. You could disagree with me. The process of establishing meanings from historical events is a highly contested one. When I found this out, it sort of consoled me because I already thought that the martial law narrative is stable, and then it is questioned. It is being reworked because this is part of the process of dealing with cultural trauma, with collective suffering. 3 kinds of contestation: historical contestation, what really happened; hermeneutical contestation, what did the events mean then and now; and affective contestation, how are we to feel about these events. Okay, so I already mentioned this earlier. Exploration of the colonial theology, or an example would be the perspective of Psikologiyang Filipino or Filipino psychology, in which they redefine our cultural values, and it leads to appreciation of our own cultural values and our heritage. To close, I propose that there are some areas that we can explore. Father Rogel talked about disentanglement of Filipino Catholic identity from Filipino identity. Why is there such a need? What would it look like? I recall the role of the Roman Catholic Church during the resistance versus martial law. Not only Cardinal Sin's call to the public to go to EDSA to protect the military officials who defected from Marcos, but also the role of priests and nuns who some of them took up arms. So for me, as a non-Catholic, I look up to the Catholic Church for moral authority and guidance, even today. So that's the first question. The second question is, how can closer collaboration with our Asian neighbors and colleagues enrich our Filipino identity? And then third, what perspectives on suffering from Asian cultures, Asian traditions, can inform our own also. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Doc Abby. And I would like to kind of just give brief responses to the three questions that you posed, perhaps just to start the discussion. No? So why do I feel that there is a need for disentanglement of Filipino Catholic identity from Filipino identity? And what would this look like? First of all, I think that this entanglement comes from my whole reflection on the Exodus experience, wherein the Israelites had to kind of detach themselves from their attachments in Egypt. They were they had to learn to stand up on their own feet, no? To leave Egypt behind and come into their own. And that is the first thing that comes into my mind. And when I look at this from the point of view of the Filipino Catholic identity and the larger Filipino identity, as we have kind of distinguished in the paper, I think there is a great need for us to disentangle the Filipino Catholic identity from the Filipino identity, precisely because there is a tendency from us Catholics to kind of just think that being Filipino is being Catholic. That is the imaginary, as Father Mario Francisco points out. No, and to look at our Filipino Catholic identity as just part of our Filipino identity, that it is not the totality of being Filipino, because there are other Filipinos who are non-Catholics or non-Christians even, so that they may not share on the level of faith the same ethos, the same belief, and therefore that has to be respected. Also, just curiously, from the point of view of the non-Catholic, the non-Christian even, I remember once when I was teaching in a high school in the southern Philippines, where there are some Muslim students. And every Monday we had what we called morning assembly, and the first part of the morning assembly would be a prayer led by one student who was picked out from a population of about 1,000 students. So this student would come before, and on that particular day, it was a Muslim student who was chosen to be the prayer leader. So the Muslim student started his prayer by invoking Allah, and of course he continued the prayer in his Islamic format. But then what surprised all of us was the ending of the prayer, because this Muslim student ended the prayer with the invocation, "We ask this through Christ our Lord." Very interestingly, I think the pressure is not only from the perspective, it is not only the unmindfulness of Catholic Filipinos in terms of brandishing their identity, but there is also pressure from the side of the non-Catholics and the non-Christians to fit in to this larger context that they find themselves in. And I think that particular anecdote kind of gives us this particular feeling that there is a need really to kind of distinguish between what we call Filipino identity and what we call Filipino Catholic identity. It is not so much to put aside our Catholic identity, because I think we should strengthen, among us who are Catholics, we should strengthen our Catholic Filipino identity. but to put it in a particular context that there is a larger Filipino identity. Secondly, I think that closer collaboration with Asian colleagues will certainly enrich our Filipino identity. And a part of the full dissertation, which I was not able to present this afternoon for lack of time, is the whole chapter which deals with the other. When we are confronted with the other, then we are able to define also ourselves. No, so I think in collaborating with our friends from other Asian countries, we will certainly also be able to continue to enrich and to define our own Filipino-ness, just as others will also be able to define their own identities in this interchange of cultures. What perspectives on suffering from Asian cultures can inform our own? We have a very common situation nowadays with the pandemic, and I think that is a good starting point. We share the same suffering, all of us, regardless of where we are coming from or where we find ourselves today. We have this situation, and I think it is a call for all of us to really to come together and to find solutions which will be of benefit for anyone, wherever that person finds himself or herself. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Rogel. And now we'd like to open the floor to everyone. So whoever has a particular reflection that you would like to share, even a sharing that was brought up by something that either Father Rogel or Dr. Abby mentioned as they were discussing, and would be able to discuss it together. Just raise your hand and we'll be able, and unmute yourself, obviously, once we call you out, and you can share your
Sister Annie raised her hand.
Yes, Sister Annie.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good afternoon,
Thank you,
Sister.
Father Rogel and Abby, for those beautiful sharing. I would like to pick up this idea of disentanglement of our Filipino identity from the Filipino Catholic identity. I would agree with Father Rogel's suggestion, because in fact, before the Spaniards came, we already had the people in our land already were, I think, open to Islam in the South. And this movement of the Muslims or Islam was aborted, in fact, because of the coming of the Spaniards. And our focus on our history of this 500 years of Christianity is always on the people who converted to Catholicism. But the Filipinos, the Muslim Filipinos, had also been fighting for their right to be recognized as Filipinos. And when I was teaching in the South, there was already this consciousness about how we have marginalized, I mean, the Filipino Catholics or the Filipino Catholic, so to say, Catholic nation marginalized our Muslim brothers and sisters. And therefore, there is a need also for us in remembering this 500 years of Christianity, how we have treated also our non-Christian, non-Catholic brothers and sisters. Then secondly, too often we focus on the Spanish colonization, the early part of our history. but we failed to take note of what happened after the Spaniards left our country. What about the American regime? How have we been? How have we lived our Catholicity, our Christianity during this period? I think it's important to look into that because there were a lot of things happening in the late 19th century where many things happened even from the church that led actually to the revolution. And then what happened when the Americans came? How Catholicism became defensive, the Catholic Church, again, because of certain events that happened. So I think to complete the picture, we also had to revisit the history, not only up to the 333rd year of Spanish colonization, but up to this point, what happened from 1901 or maybe 1898 when we became under the Americans instead of having developed our independence. And then the third thing I would like to say is we are continuously undergoing rebirth. We were never really an adult as a nation. I think there is something in the Filipinos that is always young. I would remember that older people, when you ask them, asking about, can you remember something that happened within the last 3 years? And then they will start talking about during the Spanish, during the Japanese, etc., etc. And then I had to ask, sister, ano po, the last 3 years, sisters? And then she would answer, sister, I cannot remember the recent events. I can only remember the past events. So, meaning to say, as you get older, siguro overload na ng info. So you cannot remember the recent past. But now, our young people, because they are young, and maybe we are getting younger, because we remember the recent events and we forget the past. So I guess we have to look into the conception of time and history among us Filipinos. Okay, so thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sister.
One thing I'd like to share from what was brought up, and it also comes, I'm from Malta, and I've seen in the last, especially 10 years, a big separation between Maltese as a Catholic nation and just the Maltese people. So this identity separation that you're sharing about, I think we went through something similar. I think the main characteristics of our separation was the fact that it wasn't by a conscious choice, but it was as a reaction to various political and Christian and Catholic stances. So I think that choice wasn't free in the separation. So what does a free choice look like? When a nation chooses to separate the Catholic identity and the Filipino national identity, what does the ideal separation look like?
That's an interesting question, and when I was looking at the question, what it would look like, it's a very difficult question to answer because first of all, we know that from a sociological perspective, it's difficult to kind of separate different cultural traits and conditions, no? So when you talk about culture, it all comes together. So that when you talk about disentanglement, you also have to be careful about its effects on the overall culture. Because, for example, as I said, you don't want to put aside your being a Filipino Catholic. But at the same time, you want to increase your awareness that this is only one particular way of being a Filipino that others who do not subscribe to Catholicism or to Christianity are still Filipinos. And yet they because the predominant culture is Catholic, they have to enter into that milieu. And most usually it is the minority that kind of has a difficulty in that sense because they are left out. Or if they don't want to be left out, they have to subscribe to certain ethos and beliefs. No, even if they really are not in that particular belief. No.
Father, can I
Yeah, sure.
say?
Of course.
Can I suggest that perhaps a movement from a position of dominance or domination to greater appreciation of the other? So intentionally learning about other cultures and also for example, as Sister Annie pointed out, no, what was the experience of the Muslim nation during the 500 years of Spanish rule, because they never were overcome. The Spanish never won against the Muslims. No? So what was that experience like? I also speak as a minority because when I first entered LST, of course, I was still in my evangelicalness, but the welcome of the LST community, the warm acceptance, and I was surprised that they were learning about Barth and Bultmann, and I didn't know much about them. No? So just the atmosphere of learning from others and appreciating others was very helpful for me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abby. I think we have Father Oliver also who would like to share.
Sorry, is my volume clear?
It's a bit low.
Oh, it's a bit low. How about this one?
Better.
It's okay.
How about this one?
It's okay.
Yes.
We can hear you. We can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. So I was just wondering how these arguments now that we're talking about would be revised in the light of the recent developments on the like the prediction of many theorists on the breakup and the demise of the nation state, because we know that Philippines is a very young nation state and we're still in the process of that formation. But now we're placed in a globalized society where the very identity of the nation state is being challenged, but either by globalization or reactions to globalization. And we see this, in fact, already in Europe with their advanced democracies. There's a lot of right-wing movements threatening to break up the nation state. And likewise, probably in our case. So how does that factor into the discussion? And I was wondering whether, given the vicissitudes of human history and the imagined communities, a nation state is an imagined community, doesn't the church, in fact, provide a more stable identity in the sense that it's more flexible and long-lasting? It has a, let's say, longer eschatological vision, and so that, creation to eschatology, so that it encompasses all human time. So something like that. That's more or less my ideas listening to this input. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Father Oliver. It's quite interesting that you put into the picture this whole idea of the threat that nation states are facing today. If you noticed in my presentation, I only had two developmental stages in terms of the Filipino identity. No, so we just finished the birthing with our revolutions, at least with the two revolutions I pointed out, Spain and EDSA. And then the second one is adolescence. we are still in the adolescent stage, and I think Sister Annie mentioned that she pointed out we are not yet in the adult stage. So as a nation, we are a very young nation compared to European countries and other nations, and I think that one of the urgencies, at least for us Filipinos, is catching up in terms of where we are in our own milieu as Filipinos, in our own country, developing towards coming into being as Filipinos, and yet we are also being pushed beyond that with our having to relate with the global world, the other nations, our neighbors, and those beyond our region. We have to contend with that difficulty, while others are already being threatened by the demise of the nation. We are kind of still getting into a position where we can say we have already achieved our nationhood as a full identity, no?
Can I just like to add?
Yeah.
Now that you mentioned adolescence, I was wondering if the paradigm for us now would be the shift from the tribal association, the 12 tribes, and the movement towards the monarchy, where imperialism and a new mentality became possible. Because if you're tribal and you have a loose association, somehow there's lesser oppressiveness. But the moment you envision yourself as a kind of a monarchy, the monarchy as a representative of the nation state, then you can always begin to conquer other nations and pattern yourself after the empires. So, and that's why you have the rise of colonialism and all that. So I just wondering whether the new order would be a reversion back to that kind of a tribal thing, both at the nation state. Well, when the nation state dissolves, it will revert back to that. But I think we're still too young in that thing because globalization is ongoing. I don't know how the pandemic will affect it. It may accelerate it. But I was just thinking of that biblical paradigm instead of the Exodus to understand our situation today.
But more than the tribal format, I would like to work on a more modern paradigm, which is the Brotherhood of Nations. No, so of course we see that, for example, in Europe, the European Union, they are experiencing a lot of difficulties right now, and you have the Brexit, the UK pulling back from the union, etc. Certainly, it's not a perfect system, and there are difficulties along the way. But then I think there is a lot of wisdom into this kind of gathering together instead of splintering into smaller units. I don't know. What do you think?
It would also be very nice, I mean, since we have the richness of having so many different Jesuit theological centers here, to listen to the input from other theological centers. Maybe if here are some students, and even the different cultures can help us appreciate, I think, what we're discussing. We can't discuss globalization, I think, just from one country. And that's one of our rich, treasures as Jesuit institutions, I think. And we have a comment in the chat. I think the challenge is to rename our Filipino Catholic identity as citizens of the country, while still being loyal to our Christian and Catholic faith. So, other students from Jesuit institutions.
And also professors, no?
And professors, of course.
I'm Stan from Delhi. Yeah.
Hi.
Hello.
If you raise your hand, I can pin you.
Yes.
Okay, I found you. Perfect.
Okay, Stanislav. Yeah. I was fascinated by the presentation, and then I was looking at this, the whole idea of freedom, from slavery and all that. That's one big motif we have from the scriptures, and then we are referring to. But Indic religion, especially, were looking at truth and knowledge. The prayer from Upanishads was, lead me from untruth to truth. So we are in ignorance and we need truth, rather than we are in slavery, we need freedom. So just I was looking how to relate to these things, because Hinduism, Buddhism, they were not looking at the slavery that we are into bondages and then we need to be freed, but we are in ignorance, we have to be enlightened, we need to know the truth. So the focus on the truth rather than on the freedom. So at the primordial level, very interesting alternatives that have been explored in various ways. But then religion can become a force to enhance freedom or again push you to bondage, So how Catholicism continuously enhances people's freedoms, or does it simply take a bike seat, or that becomes an oppressive force that in the worst case? I was just thinking.
Thank you, Father Stani. In fact, one of the major things that we are kind of really discussing in our current political and religious situation in the Philippines is the truth, no? The search for the truth. Oftentimes we hear these days fake news and social media that is actually where fake news abounds, and therefore the necessity to speak about the truth, to let the truth surface from all of this. And in a way, I think that it is one of those unfreedoms that we have. And therefore, the relationship between truth and freedom is very, very close. When you are not able to speak of the truth, when you are not able to let the truth come out, then there is certainly an unfreedom there. And
they can enlighten each other and reinforce each other. They are not
exactly
alternatives. They are not alternatives. We need both, obviously. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Other reflections, observations, sharings?
Yeah, I would like to give a short comment. Thank you, Father Rogel, for this presentation. And the response as well. I really enjoy this kind of conversation because it seems to me that Indonesia, my own country, my own context is very different from the one that you presented, right? But my question is with regard to the discourse on post-coloniality or post-colonial discourse, whether that kind of discourse has enriched the understanding of identity that you presented, Filipino Catholic identity, because you went from the pre-colonial period, colonial period, and post-colonial period. But I'm not sure if you are also interested in pursuing this type of inquiry, post-colonial discourse on theology, on identity, race, and new empire, all those things. I'm sure you're familiar with that. And the story of the Exodus, for example, is pretty much is very insightful in this new context of the global empire, for example. The demise of the nation states that Father Dai has just mentioned, for example. So I'm not sure if you can give me some comments on this, the usefulness of post-colonial theory, for example, to problematize that discourse on identity in the Filipino Catholic context. Thank you, Father.
Yes, thank you, Father Bagus. Certainly, post-colonial theory has been the focus in recent years and has been used as a lens to look at certain aspects of socio-religious perspectives, no, and definitely it can be used as a way of looking at how the collective identity is formed after all of the colonial experiences that we have gone through, and certainly it will be an enriching discourse. I am not particularly in my work, I did not deal with that because certainly that would have extended and had gone into a very different direction. No? So that is a very interesting idea of looking into the post-colonial theory as a way to also look at collective identities. For example, Sister Annie was also mentioning that, in fact, I was only looking at the post-Spanish, or rather, only viewing the Spanish colonization as a point of reference for my paper. There is a whole period of the American colonization, which is much shorter. It's only about 40 years in the Philippines now after the Spaniards, but that is also a very rich area of study, which can also contribute to this whole discourse on collective identity. Certainly, I limited my vision on those two areas of oppressions, which were one external and one internal. The Marcos regime, just to make a sweeping analysis. But the post-colonial theory would be a good theory to apply to this problematic of collective identity. I think so. But that's a big work. That's another dissertation.
Yes. Thank you.
So in the meantime, I'd like to read some comments we've received in the chat. So, and please forgive me for the pronunciation of your names. So we have Tran Nguyen from Vietnam asked how to resolve the temptation of getting the benefit by identifying oneself as a large group, Catholic for Filipino and kin group for Vietnamese, rather than the minority.
How to resolve the temptation of getting, yeah.
Yeah, it's tempting to be in the majority because it's normally more comfortable in a certain sense. I think it depends on the majority that it is. I would foresee that a Catholic majority, because of our Catholic beliefs, should try to help us go towards humility and service. So that very majority should seek to not reap the benefits of being the majority. Obviously, reality shows us that it's not always the case. But I think actually going to the root of it, of a majority that can look to humility and service as
Some voice disruptions.
Yes. There is another comment here from Oli Lucas from the Philippines. While we may still be predominantly Catholic, Christian sects are growing very fast. this puts into question if the problem is looking for a Catholic, sorry,
looking for a Catholic national identity, or but simply what a Filipino Catholic identity is. That EDSA has a primarily Catholic character, but maybe because its interpreters have been Catholics. But where does this put the political left, who were in the forefront of the fight against martial law and who are not faith-based?
Yes. And this is what I was pointing at when I said we have to disentangle the Filipino Catholic identity from the Filipino identity, precisely to be more sensitive to the non-Catholic and the non-faith-based individuals who exercise as well their political rights as citizens of the country, and therefore we have to be more careful with that, no? And in the same manner that the previous comment about the temptation of being the majority and just being not sensitive to the minority. And I think that works in any given situation, not just the Catholic, non-Catholic binary, but also even the in terms of the majority lowlanders against the indigenous in the uplands or in the islands. No, the same discourse applies.
I think that's why it's important that various sectors of Filipino society tell their stories. So, for example, the stories of the political left, they need to write them down so that they can be transmitted, and we can learn from their stories.
And I think in our own history in the Philippines, in terms of the political leanings, somehow the left has always been in a way demonized. They have always been seen as the bad guys, no, up there in the mountains, waiting to ambush people or doing this or that, no, so that they have not been seen as on equal footing with other political persuasions. So I suppose that also needs a maturation of the different political persuasions that exist in the country.
So I'd like to thank everyone for participating today, especially those of
Connection is lost.
Maybe someone from the Theological Committee?
Yes, I think Rob's connection is getting problems. So yes, thank you very much for those who participated in our conversation this afternoon. It's very nice to hear the research of Father Rogel and of course the response of Dr. Abigail Te. It enriched our knowledge on the Filipino identity and our continuous struggle looking for it, identifying ourselves, and of course getting out from our just being a Catholic, but also trying to listen with other religion as well. And so we come to an end. We thank you for those who participated our activity for this afternoon, and we hope we can see you once again on our next theological conversation on February 16th. And the next host.
Yes, sorry for jumping in, Sister Joy. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Because on February 16th, I see here that it's going to be a presentation from the Graduate School of Theology in Sogang University in Seoul. So we thank them for the work they're going to put into it, and we also urge all of you who participated today, if you enjoyed it, to spread the word about these within your institution, so that we can get bigger participation. Because the more different voices we can hear in these conversations, the more enriching that they can be for our reflections. So thank you everyone for your participation. For some of us, it's dinner time.
Yes.
And for some of you,
Thank
it
you
might
very
be tea time.
much.
So
Thank you, Father
very much.
Rogel.
And have a nice
you.
afternoon
Eric.
or evening.
Thank you,
Thank
Rob.
you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much, Rob.
Thank you, Father.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you, Rob.
Bless you all.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Joy.
Thanks to everyone.